I think because they're all the same network of power. Merz used to be a CEO of BlackRock for Germany. Emmanuel Macron used to be a Rothschild banker in France. Keir Starmer, not so much, but Keir Starmer is a stand-in for Tony Blair in the same way as Joe Biden was a stand-in for Barack Obama. And Tony Blair is part of the City of London governance structure. After he delivered them the Iraq war in 2003, they rewarded him with a $5 million a year consulting contract. Then they made him the envoy for peace for the Middle East and on. And he is still deeply involved with all these events, with Ukraine, with the Middle East, with Syria, with Lebanon, with Israel. And Starmer is just one of his puppet proteges who is probably doing whatever Tony Blair tells him to do. And then Tony Blair does whatever his employers tell him to do. And his employers are almost certainly the money-lending oligarchies that rule the City of London. And then whether we're talking about Merz or Starmer or Macron, they all answer to the same ultimate structures of power, to the same powers that be that rule both London and Paris, and also have certain dominance in Germany, which could slip away from them if Merz is overthrown in some way or voted out of office. Then who knows, maybe AfD is going to take over. They're going to have to cancel German democracy in that case. And the same thing could happen with Emmanuel Macron, which is why they have canceled his main challenger, Marine Le Pen. But that's a fight that they're constantly fighting. And then when they have their sock puppets in government, then they can do the division of labor. Starmer is now under pressure because he's doing, not only is he pushing these wars, backing Israel, backing Ukraine, he's also engaged in more and more heavy-handed suppression of dissent in Britain. And now in Britain, there's widespread perception that the country is likely to slip into a civil war, that there's going to be a massive revolt, a revolution on the streets of Britain. So then maybe the unpopular causes like the Ukraine war, maybe that torch goes to Merz for the time being. And Macron is still okay. He could help out, but maybe Starmer has to sit down and be quiet for a while. I'm not 100% certain, but the new government in Poland it's a bit more difficult for me to read because they're still not very friendly to the Russians, but they're also not so friendly to the Ukrainians anymore because they're very sensitive to the World War II events in which the Ukrainian Nazi supporters slaughtered large numbers of Poles in the Katyn massacre and others. And so they're not happy with I forget, is it 2 million Ukrainian refugees that are in Poland or 1.6 million? I forget the number, but there's a very large number of Ukrainian refugees that are in Poland that are in privileged positions, and the Polish people are resenting it. And then the European Union is to help Ukraine. They're giving Ukrainian agricultural production a privileged position in European markets, which is making life very difficult for Polish farmers, and not just Polish, but also Romanian and Hungarians and so forth. They resent that as well. So while there's no discernible dissent in terms of hostility towards Russia, there's definitely a dissent in terms of supporting Ukraine. And then some other things like policy on migrations and all these things. So I think that we will know more with time, but for the time being, it's a half story. They're resenting the Project Ukraine, and they want to extricate themselves from it, but they're not necessarily on leaning towards very friendly terms with Russia. But then this is a very dangerous thing because if you'll recall, I think it was 2009 or so, the Russians made the outreach to try to improve Russian relations with Poland. And Vladimir Putin went to the site of the Katyn massacre from World War II, and he officially apologized to the people of Poland, and he acknowledged for the first time that the Soviets were partly responsible for this. And because up until then, the massacre was packaged as a Nazi atrocity. But the truth is that it was a Soviet atrocity. The Polish knew it, the Russians knew it, but the official narrative couldn't be questioned. And then Putin came to Poland and he acknowledged this and he issued an official apology. And so I think the day after that, or 2 days after that, there was a whole plane load of Polish officials, including the Polish president and a bunch of military generals, who flew for talks to Russia. And then somehow mysteriously that whole plane fell out of the sky and everybody on board was killed. And I don't know what the official status of that investigation is, but it seems to me that, somebody in the world, some great power, doesn't want anybody in the West to have friendly relations with Russia. And anybody who goes to cultivate good relations with Russia, in the end, suffers consequences. And I think that Trump is maybe now the only person in the world who is in the Western world, who is strong enough politically that he can start improving relations with Russia. But it's not yet visible from Poland. I think that the West set up their own government in Ukraine, which was not democratic, in 2014. It was a military junta. And the whole point of it was to draw Russia into a trap, into a quagmire that would weaken Russia, that would enable the West to destabilize Russia and bring about a regime change. So from that point of view, they didn't need Ukraine to win anything, and they didn't care what happens to Ukraine or how many Ukrainians they sacrifice in the process. They just wanted to weaken and destabilize Russia. That was the purpose. And then if there were delusional people in Ukraine who thought that they could defeat Russia, I think their numbers were very small. And I think that what happened is that you put certain loyal people in positions of power and you give them incentives to push the whole society in that direction. I think they were run maybe 2 weeks before the war actually broke out. And they were asking people in Ukraine, if Russians attack, would you defend the country with weapons? Would you stand up and defend the country against the Russians? And the huge majority of Ukrainians said no. They were not interested in that war, even at that late stage, already in 2022, which tells you that this at no point had anything to do with Ukrainian people. This had to do with certain structures of power that were set up by the Western powers, the United States and Britain and NATO countries, Poland and Germany included. And the objective of it was to subjugate Russia, to destroy it, to partition it, and to eliminate it as a political entity with any power on Eurasian landmass. Obviously, with the view of carrying forward, then the next stop was China. But to get to China, you needed to tame Russia first. And that was the whole role of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And the fact that they sacrificed 1.7 million Ukrainians, they don't care. They don't care at all. They never had it in mind to do anything good for Ukraine. And the preparations for this go back to 1991, from the time when Ukraine became an independent country, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Almost immediately, NATO went in there. And then they started having military exercises together in 1995. And then in Madrid, they signed the Treaty of Distinctive Partnership between NATO and Ukraine. And it just went on and on until the coup, when the cooperation and coordination and preparations went full on. And Ukrainians never asked for that, and nobody asked the Ukrainian people for it. And because the Ukrainians were opposed to this, majority of Ukrainians never wanted to enter NATO to begin with. This is why in 2014 it was necessary to stage a coup and replace the democratically elected government with a military junta. And then the rest has been what we saw: preparations for war, a provocation to Russia, and then fighting Russia and making sure that fighting continued, because there's been several attempts, both on Russian and Ukrainian side, to come to some kind of a peace deal to stop the war. And the Western powers always intervened to prevent the peace from breaking out, to make sure that the war continues. And this is where we're at. And unfortunately, I have to say that if people don't learn from this, then the same could happen to Romania, to Poland, to Moldova, to all of them. And we need to understand where this is coming from and why. Obviously, it has nothing to do with freedom and democracy. It has nothing to do with human rights. It has nothing to do with joining NATO or joining the EU. It all has to do with money-lending oligarchies extending their colonial control over the whole world. And Russia, Iran, China are in the way of that, and they have to be destroyed. One thing has changed after 500 years of this, 450, let's call it, and that is the internet, because we never had this. And we never had the ability to see and hear Russian leaders in their own words. We never could have Tucker Carlson interviewing Vladimir Putin. We could never see Sergei Lavrov speak for a full hour or two to the Western audiences. We could never see the Russian people in social media and find the truth in real time. When we had the Polish-Lithuanian invasion, and then we had the Swedish invasion on Russia and Napoleon, and it's just been wave after wave of European powers attacking Russia. Some of it was outright military invasions like Poland, Sweden, Napoleon, France, Hitler. Some of it was like subversion, color revolutions, infiltration. And so this has been going on nonstop and always justified to domestic audiences in the West as Russia is bad, Russia is communist, Russians are ogres, troglodytes, they're backwards, they're Huns, they're Asiatic hordes, and so on. So I think that's a factor that is unprecedented, but it definitely changes the social equation. And the way it changes it, we don't know because we will only be finding out now. But it seems to me that today, this factor of frightening the populations in the West, that there's these barbarian hordes that will overrun us unless we arm to our teeth and go to war, I think that this no longer works. And I think that this is part of the problem because they've been trying to scare us about Russia. But I know from a variety of sources that the opinions in the West, even in Western Europe, in places like France and Germany, the opinions are very divided. And I think that the majority of people does not believe that Russia is really a threat to us. So if you try to mobilize them, send them to war, have them destroy their countries and sacrifice hundreds of thousands of their children, it's not going to work like it did 70 years ago and 100 years ago, World War II, World War I, and before that. I think that if you paid attention to statements of, let's say, certain European leaders and military leaders, Western military leaders, then it's very clear that it's Western powers that are running the show in Ukraine, that Zelensky is simply there, a stand-in, a sock puppet. And people like General Hodges, General Breedlove, Mark Milley, and so forth, they have been pushing the military strategy of Ukrainian armed forces and the governance of Ukrainian government. And then there's been heavy involvement by MI6 under Sir Richard Moore and so forth. And they have been talking about doing recruitment more aggressively, recruiting more women into the armed forces of Ukraine, recruiting younger people, recruiting older people. All of those pressures were coming from the West. And we know that we had these British think tanks who have been quite open in their reports about the imperative need for the war in Ukraine to continue. So that they didn't care how many Ukrainians died. They just needed the war to carry on, to go on. And they still need that because now the European leaders are talking about picking up the torch in 2028 or 29. But in order for that to happen, they need the war to go on. They need to prevent peace from happening because then you have the problem of how do you start a brand new war? If one is already going on, then you can always finagle the crisis to throw in some troops. Macron again is banging the drum about these reassurance troops, and he's scaring everybody with this bloodthirsty ogre that's at our doors, meaning the Russians. And so if the mess is continuing, then you can just join that mess. If peace breaks out, then you have a problem. How do we orchestrate a brand new war and get it started, which is not easy to do. Let's remember where we were 7 months ago. We had Joe Biden in the White House, and we had American foreign policy driven by Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken. This is very radically different. And I know that it's maybe difficult to appreciate because Trump has dragged us through 7 months of psyops and misdirection and deception and lies and nonsense. But I think that this was not part of the genuine policymaking. I think that this was part of the stage-managed chaos so that nobody knows what to expect and what's going to happen in the end. Because he says, Trump gives a statement which says exactly nothing. Putin's tired of this. Putin is not going to make the error of drawing a defeat out of the jaws of victory just because he's tired and he lost patience. And then Trump himself says, oh yeah, it's not going to be a problem. I don't think it's going to be a problem. Yeah, it's not going to be a problem because the Russians are going to say no. And then he says, we'll find out in a couple of weeks' time. And this interview, most people will not even remember it tomorrow, let alone 7 weeks from now. But one thing I wanted to note, there was a photograph of Zelensky with Trump along with that statement. It strikes me because I don't think we've seen Zelensky this happy in about 3 years now. And I think that the real things were being discussed covertly between the Russian government and the American government. All of this nonsense of General Kellogg and the ceasefire, I think this was just, let's call it narrative appeasement to certain interest networks in the West. I think that Trump was never seriously pushing for the ceasefire. And the reason why I believe that is because it was so obvious that this was unacceptable to Russia and that Russia didn't need to even discuss this at all. And in the discussions between Trump with Putin on the phone that started in February, and the number of meetings that Steve Witkoff had with Putin and with Lavrov, I think that Russians had plenty of opportunity to make that perfectly clear for them. And I doubt that people in the Trump administration or he himself are stupid to not understand this. So I think that the reason why they were even pushing this story about the ceasefire was simply some kind of a diversion, a psychological operation. It was a narrative for public consumption, but I think it wasn't sincere. It seems to me that the Europeans have made themselves so passive and so subservient to the United States, to the Anglo-American establishment, that for decades now, not only have they followed the policies dictated by this Anglo-American elite to them, they've atrophied in every sense. They haven't charted their own course. They haven't thought through any kind of a geostrategic path forward, a strategy of economic development, what European societies should be about, what should be their policy, what should be their aims, what should be their aspirations. They just simply adopted passively this business model of, okay, we will procure resources, energy from Russia and other sources, and natural resources from our former colonies. We will produce advanced industrial goods and we will export them to Russia, to the United States and China. And this approach got entrenched. It seems to me that the high-level thinkers and let's say the policymakers in Europe had the expectancy that the United States would always be their best friend forever, and that they would always be able to depend and lean on the United States, and that this state of affairs would last indefinitely. Every so often you'll have reactions against this, and a part of American political establishment that will attempt to chart an independent course. And in the past we had, I don't know, William McKinley, you had FDR, you had John F. Kennedy, and some others, depending on how you analyze it and how far they got with their attempt to change course of the United States. But Donald Trump is not something unique and radically different. He's only the latest that is trying to change course of US policy away from being the errand boy for European colonial interests. What they didn't take into account is that this is not necessarily favorable to US interests. And for anybody who read their history, they should know that periodically, maybe once in a generation or two, there's always a reaction from out of the United States to break these bonds with the old colonialist powers of Europe, because they always treat the United States also as their colonial possession. They want the United States to absorb their products, and they want the United States to keep peace in the world for them and to fight wars for them. And that is basically, that has been exhausting the United States. It's been depleting the United States politically and economically and financially, and it has shredded its reputation. And we have to always remember that the United States became a country exactly as a reaction against this colonialist mindset and this model of governance. Meanwhile, European leaders have become complacent in this relationship of subordination to the United States and leaning on the United States to protect their interests. And now that Trump has shown definitely that he's no longer interested, I think they're completely lost. They have no contingency plan. They have no plan B. They realize they have made no provisions for their own security. They have no independent political or economic strategies. And so they're lost. They're looking pale. They have these blank face expressions. And now they have to go back to square one and figure out what to do. I think that European Union itself, without the protective umbrella from the United States, is going to devolve to squabbling powers. And I think the European Union has no future anymore. I think the same is true for NATO. And so I think that as incompetent as those 7 leaders in the White House are, they're smart enough to understand this, that they have nothing to offer their voters. I was very surprised because on the morning of the day, I wrote in my newsletter that we will probably be able to tell more about the outcome of the meeting by the body language of Mr. Zelensky than we will by anything that they tell us in press releases and in conferences for the press. And I was surprised that it's the European leaders who looked the way I expected Zelensky to look, kind of panicked, despondent, not happy. Whereas Zelensky, I looked at him, he looked pretty relaxed. He looked comfortable. And I suspect because he was having a meeting with Trump one-on-one for, I think they allocated more than an hour for that meeting. And only then did they have a meeting together, Zelensky, Trump, and the Europeans. And I suspect that Trump gave Vladimir Zelensky like a golden parachute, like a lifesaver deal to say, look, cooperate with this peace deal and you can extricate yourself with your head on your shoulder. We'll let you walk away with this alive. And I think that this is, at this stage, this is what must be Zelensky's prime preoccupation, whether he will even save his life with the defeat of Ukraine. And probably he had Vladimir Putin's reassurances that they will not go after Zelensky. And I think that this is why he was as relaxed as he was, whereas when he had that press conference with Mark Rutte, Zelensky looked like he just saw death. Whereas the difference with the European leaders is that everybody came there as a supplicant to Trump. nobody came there as a sovereign making demands or ready to give concessions. They came to beg. They came to daddy hoping to make sure that he still loves them, that he will still protect them and stay with them. And it was almost embarrassing to see them sitting around his desk as wayward children at the principal's office. And they all looked like that. And the two leaders in their meeting obviously gave the impression that they control their respective sides of their camps. They were in control. They were capable of making deals, of entering into negotiations, and so forth. And on the other hand, it was the European leaders who looked like they saw death this time around. And I suspect that part of the reason has to do with those frozen Russian assets. And I have to throw that in there because one of the things that Donald Trump has been doing in his shuttle diplomacy around the world is he's been getting other nations to make very heavy, very significant investments in the United States. So he got Ursula von der Leyen to commit $600 billion in EU investments in the United States. He got multi-$100 billion deals with the UAE, with Qatar, with Saudi Arabia, and so forth. And of course, I very much doubt that Trump wouldn't like a very significant investment from the Russians. And the Russians have about $300 to $335 billion in frozen assets in the West. And most of that money is in Europe. So it's supposedly about $70 billion in France, about $37 billion in the UK. I think something like more than 150, 180 billion in Belgium, in Euroclear. And I'm sure that Trump, and in the United States, there's only an estimated 5 to 8 billion. That's it. And European powers have already been counting on that money as collateral that they would use to fuel another credit cycle. Emmanuel Macron has been already, or his prime minister or his finance minister, I don't remember exactly, but a few months ago, they were fantasizing about using this money as collateral with which they would then allow French banks to finance French corporations to do reconstruction and development work in Ukraine. So they would say, oh, Russia destroyed Ukraine, so it's right that Russia should pay for the reconstruction, so we should use that. So I'm sure that the very obvious deal that Trump and Putin could do is to say, hey, about those frozen assets, maybe it would be nice if you invested it in the United States. We will make sure it's preferable to EU. We will unfreeze them. We will lift some sanctions, blah, blah, blah. And if Vladimir Putin or if Russian government ordered the European countries to transfer those funds to New York, and Donald Trump said, better do it, they would have no recourse but to comply with that. So they were making all these calculations and they had all these expectations about being able, together with the United States, to simply confiscate Russian assets. And now I think that nothing's going to come of this. And instead, Trump is going to take the money back into the United States. And he's going to make a deal with the Russians. And I think the Russians themselves have every reason in the world to want to do that as well, because the direct threat to Russia is coming from Western Europe and countries like Britain, France, Germany, and Poland. And that's exactly who you would want to deprive of that capital, because for sure, in the end, it would end up funding rearmament that would ultimately be targeting Russia. So I think that nobody mentioned this before, but I think it's an obvious blow to Europe that I think neither Putin nor Trump will be hesitating to deliver. And I think if there's one thing that's predictable about Donald Trump, is that he will want those $300 billion in the United States.